There are a growing number of countries facing debt distress, and there is growing pressure to address climate objectives and conservation priorities. As global experts and leaders look for solutions, one of the tools that has come up is the debt for climate or debt for nature swap. At a basic level, a debt for nature swap is a financial transaction where part of a country's debt is forgiven in exchange for commitments to spend on climate or environment-related objectives. So in some of these debt for climate swaps, it might be that an individual country decides to forgive the debt. In other cases, an NGO or philanthropic capital might come in and buy the debt. In recent cases, we've even seen that banks are getting involved. We'll dive into some of the details around how these transactions work. But first, I wanted to give you a little bit of history. These swaps have been around since the late 1980s, and they grew in popularity in the 1990s, in part because the United States used them as part of its response to the Latin American debt crisis. While their use dropped after the 1990s, there have been about 140 of these types of transactions over the years. Through 2022, the total amount of debt that had been dealt with through these types of transactions was about $3.7 billion. But a recent transaction is going to significantly increase that number. Still, that total number is much lower than other debt treatment programs over the years. Now for a few examples. Back in 2017, the Nature Conservancy, an environmental NGO, bought about $20 million of the Seychelles debt. They bought that through a combination of loans and grants. They then set up a local trust fund, and as the government pays back that debt, that money is going to support local environmental programs, marine protection, fisheries management, as well as paying back investors and creating an endowment so that these protected areas have a pool of funds to draw on in the years ahead. But the biggest deal to date, the one that's really much larger than the average of somewhere in the $26 million range, was a deal that was announced in May of 2023. That deal converted about $1.6 billion of Ecuador's commercial debt into a new $656 million loan. So how did that happen? Credit Suisse bought Ecuador's distressed debt on the markets at a discounted rate, and then converted that into a lower cost, longer term loan. They were able to do that in part by raising money through a conservation-linked Galapagos marine bond. The US International Development Finance Corporation also provided more than $600 million in political risk insurance, and the Inter-American Development Bank provided an $85 million guarantee to support the project. In exchange for that more than $1 billion in debt payment savings, the government of Ecuador committed to spend at least $17 million over the next 18 years on marine conservation and fisheries management in the Galapagos area. That money will be managed by a new trust, and a portion of that money every year will go to create an endowment so that the area will have access to funding well beyond that 18 years. One thing that's unique about this Ecuador transaction is that it's the first time that a multilateral development bank guarantee and a development finance institution's political risk insurance were used in one of these swaps. So while there's potential excitement about some of these deals, it's important to note that they take a long time to put together. That Ecuador deal took almost 4 years. And a number of experts also warn that these swaps are not always the right solution. Why? Because some countries in the most debt distress might not have the tools or skills they need to negotiate these swaps effectively. It might not always be the most efficient way to address either debt or climate needs as well. But they are an instrument that can serve a purpose in certain situations, perhaps as part of a broader debt workout, or if they really are an instrument for bringing new actors, new players into development finance. And one thing I've also heard is that it might be a way to get private creditors, say banks or investors, to the table in these debt conversations. The reality is that many countries will still need a much broader package of debt relief. But with the large-scale Ecuador deal in the books, we'll be watching to see if the momentum around these debt for climate or debt for nature swaps picks up. You can find all that coverage in our weekly Devex Invested newsletter, our daily newswire, and of course at devex.com.